they're using experimental aircraft, then it started to move and do things as it did this. It lifted off the floor, and then it rotated and went the other way. Well, when I saw what was on the front, I was really shocked because it said U.S. Air Force.
No way.
It had a U.S. flight emblem just above it, so I said that thing. Oh my goodness!
No way.
And so I told the guy.
Did you go on record at least saying that?
Who would do something like this?
Welcome back to Total Disclosure. I am your host, Ty, and tonight we have something extraordinary. What happens when a man entrusted with the lives of our nation's astronauts, the very chief flight surgeon for NASA, decides it's time to speak the truth? Dr. Gregory Rogers isn't just another name on a list. He's not just another military veteran. He was a guardian of human performance in the harshest environments imaginable. Space. From West Germany in the Cold War to Cape Canaveral at the dawn of a new era, Dr. Rogers has been at the epicenter of American aerospace medicine. But behind the polished resume lies a secret. For decades, he's remained silent, bound by duty, by clearance, fear, until now. In this exclusive Total Disclosure episode that is brought to you in part and mainly by the International UFO Bureau, Dr. Rogers breaks ranks and steps out of the shadows to share what he's never shared publicly before. His direct experience seeing a flying saucer. Not speculation, not a story, but a firsthand account from a man who's walked the corridors of NASA and looked after those who left Earth. This isn't, again, just another whistleblower. This is the chief flight surgeon, and what he's about to tell us may change the way we look at reality.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world. And yet, I ask you, is not an alien force already among us?
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists.
The whole fleet of them look on the ASA. They're all going against the wind. The wind's 120 knots.
You solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
Do you believe that our government is in possession of UAPs?
Absolutely.
All right, so we're back with Dr. Gregory Rogers, NASA chief flight surgeon for many years, author of an amazing book, Impact. That's a lot of information, and from someone who's highly credible, such as yourself, due to the jobs you've had, the clearances you've held. I really want to make sure that we were able to cover everything here. So before we dive into what you've witnessed, can you walk us through what your role as NASA's chief flight surgeon and what kind of responsibilities and clearances came with that?
Okay, well, I was actually the chief of aerospace medicine for the 45th Space Wing. Now, the 45th Space Wing owned Cape Canaveral Air Force Station, but NASA actually is the owner of Kennedy Space Center. But we worked hand in hand for the space program. The only thing that separated us was, the Banana River. If you cross the bridge, you're on Kennedy Space Center. If you cross the bridge the other way, you're on Cape Canaveral. So I was responsible for, at the time of launch, being the senior flight surgeon for the astronaut rescue and recovery team. We had these helicopters, HH-3 Jolly Green Giants, and so I was usually on Jolly 1. We had another flight surgeon on Jolly 2, and then another flight surgeon on Jolly 3. If anything happened on the pad or after launch or during the landing and the astronauts were injured, we would swoop in, pick them up, provide medical care, and then get into an appropriate hospital. So for the astronauts, that was what we did.
Okay. So you've served in both Army and Air Force. You were stationed at Cape Canaveral. During that time, did you ever encounter protocols or situations that, looking back, maybe seemed unusual given the information, that you have now?
The security protocols at Cape Canaveral Air Force Station at the time, now it's Cape Canaveral Space Force base, but they were extremely tight. One of the funny things that would happen is sometimes we'd have visitors who thought they were important, and so like a 3-star general drives up to the front gate and at Cape Canaveral and says, "Hey, I want to see what's going on inside. I'm a 3-star general," and the guards would say, "Well, you may be a 3-star general, but you do not have authorization to enter this facility, sir. You're going to have to turn around and leave." So the security measures for what we were doing on Cape Canaveral were very tight.
Wow. Okay. And, I know that you don't like to necessarily speculate, but in the UFO world, in the UFO community, there's been a lot of talk about NASA and potential like esoteric rituals that were performed. I mean, if you even look at the names of the launches, whether it's Artemis or Apollo or Columbia, you go through all these things, and there seems to be something more to it. Did you ever wonder about any of that?
Well, yes and no. One thing people didn't really know about the space shuttle orbiters, they were not named for space objects or anything else. They were actually named after famous ships that were in the America's Cup. So Challenger, Atlantis, Columbia were originally ships or speedboats that were in the competition, and so they actually chose those names from that. For the spacecraft, they did go largely to Greek mythology, and so Gemini, there's 2 of them. Well, that's kind of easy, but why they specifically chose mythological names as something that I heard speculated about, but absolutely no official information.
What was the speculation among NASA employees?
Well, the names came from the people at the top. So if the people at the top had any sort of link to outer space visitors, UFOs, anything like that, perhaps that may be why they went back to Greek mythology. But generally speaking, I think they just wanted to use names that sounded cool. I get it. When we went to the moon, we even had one of the spacecraft that was named Snoopy after the cartoon series. Right.
Yeah. So that's also a very, very good point. And I've always wondered, because we look at people like Jack Parsons and his connection to the esoteric, and mainly being the father of rocketry, and then Werner von Braun, who famously was brought here from Germany, Nazi Germany, after the win of the war, to develop the NASA space program. And you start to wonder if there's something other or something more to it than just names of spacecraft, or were they actually, some sort of ritualistic way of ensuring that the program was successful. I know it's
the early race for the space program was whether the Germans we had captured could beat the Germans that the Russians had captured. So they had different reasons for choosing names, and some of them were rather curious. For instance, we could have beaten the Soviets into space with Sputnik. But we had one of the Redstone rockets that Werner von Braun was working on that had actually, I believe, exceeded 16,000 miles an hour. Well, 17,000 miles an hour is orbital speed. So if you get to 17,000 miles an hour, you drop off a satellite, it stays in orbit.
Right.
From what I heard, President Eisenhower did not like the idea of the Germans being the ones that put America in space. So he wanted the American project in Vanguard, which was owned by the Navy, to be the first ones to orbit a satellite, but they kept having setbacks. So when the Soviets launched Sputnik, he told the Vanguard people, get out there and launch. Well, it blew up on the pad. So that was no good. So they went back to Werner von Braun and said, look, paint your rocket some other color. We're going to name it the Juno 1 because we don't want people to know that it could have launched last year. So they changed the name of the rocket to the Juno 1, and we launched the Explorer 1 satellite. Now, the Sputnik did nothing but send radio signals to say it was there. Explorer 1 actually had scientific information, and we discovered confirmation of the Van Allen belts of ionizing radiation circling the Earth.
Mm-hmm.
But we could have done it earlier. Okay, paint the rocket something else, change the name of it. Now we'll go to space. So that's when we finally got the Explorer 1 into space. But those are the kind of backroom deals, largely due to politics.
Politics,
that,
yes.
Causes great problems for the space program. I think you mentioned my book, Impact. One of the reasons I wrote it was because the NASA managers, due to costs and launch weights, refused to send repair kits with the astronauts. And so in 1989, 1990, 91, 92, I found this extremely disturbing. Lots of other people did too. It wasn't just me, but I decided to write a space shuttle novel explaining through the story, we've got a huge problem. So in my story, we launch an orbiter, it becomes damaged and has a puncture through the thermal protection tiles. And so because there's no repair kit, the only way these people have a chance to come home is for us to launch an unmanned rocket that they could rendezvous with, get the repair kit, seal the hole, and then use reinforced carbon-carbon to cover the external portion of it, and then come back and land. Well, 8 years later, the reinforced carbon was damaged at
Columbia.
81 seconds into the launch. The Columbia crew had no repair kit. Because they had no repair kit, NASA didn't do anything, because even if they found a hole, what were they going to do? They had no repair kit. So they just sort of hoped that, just like many other times before, we had terrible problems, and they said, we'll probably make it fine. And in previous ones, we did. But
weren't so fortunate with that one.
I think if you go back to Hoot Gibson, he has gone on the record about one of his early DoD missions, and he and his crew thought they were going to die, and when they landed and they saw how badly the orbiter had been damaged, they said, "Oh my goodness, we got to do something." But the thing is, movement of changes within the space program are extremely difficult because of all the bureaucracy. So even though I wrote my book in 1995, I had book signing with Buzz Aldrin. I had a book signing with Jim Lovell Jr., the commander of Apollo 13. People knew about my story, but
Absolutely.
they did not do anything about it. And so 8 years later, we lost the Columbia because of damage to the thermal protection tiles, with the reinforced carbon on the leading edge of the left wing, not too distant from where I had damaged my orbiter in my story. Had they actually had a repair kit and just covered that hole, the crew returns, the orbiter's damaged, but you can fix that, and it would just be another near miss. But with no repair kit, it wasn't a near miss. It was a
catastrophic failure.
Yeah.
So do you think now, in your educated and experienced opinion, why were they so ignorantly, why was NASA so non-attentive to said issue if tons of employees were raising warning flags? Or was it a case of nobody wanted to raise the warning flag because they didn't want to lose their job?
Well, there were other people besides me who had raised the warning flag, but the problem is the lower level people working on the orbiter were totally out of touch with the NASA managers at the top. And at the top, they're worried about the finances. If you put weight onto a space shuttle orbiter at the time of launch, you have to take something else off. They weren't interested in doing this. So they said, we're taking a calculated risk, but we think it'll be okay. Well, it was okay until it wasn't. And when it wasn't, they killed the crew.
And you think that this could have been...
Had that crew been able to repair this hole, it's maybe like 18 inches. You repair an 18-inch hole and the crew doesn't die and the orbiter survives. And then you fix it on the ground.
Right.
I cannot tell you how frustrated I was when that happened.
Well, I can't even imagine. And of course, this is where things kind of start. And, I just want to say, because you did bring up DoD space flights, and I just wanted to get this off my chest while we're on the topic, because now obviously there was the public facing space program. Do you, as a NASA employee in general, as a DoD, as a career man, is there something to the idea that there could be a more secretive space program that is funded through black money?
Well, in a certain extent, we already know that it happened. The X-15 was a vehicle that could actually reach into physiologic space. There were members of the X-15 crews who got their astronaut wings based on what they did with the X-15 and not as part of NASA. If you go to Kennedy Space Center, there's a wall where it shows the name of astronauts who have died. When you look at those names, you're going to see some that were never directly associated with NASA, but they were flying other experimental aircraft that had the power to reach space, even if it wasn't orbital. So with that as an example, it is very easy to say, well, yeah, once they started it, they also did it here or there. They have an experimental aircraft or spacecraft that now sort of looks like a space shuttle. It's unmanned, but they send it up and it can stay up in space over a year. Well, no one knows what it's doing, but you know it's doing something important. So I'm not going to dismiss that as something inconsequential, because there's no telling all of the implications there. We had missions where before launch, we knew what was going on, but they were not going to tell the public. I mentioned the Air Force Technical Application Center. One time I deployed on what was called a constant globe mission. And so we went to the South America, and we did things to check the weather. Officially, it was a WC-135, so it was a weather plane. So we checked the weather in South America, but it was related to the context of what AFTAC does. And so anyone who's interested can look up what AFTAC does, and then you can probably sort of figure out what we were doing there.
This is, and I don't mean to go off on a side journey there, but the secret. There's been a lot of controversy with a potential secret space program, because we know that there are charlatans out there, and there are hoaxers out there, grifters, who have perpetrated a whole mythos behind the secret space program, and even gone as far to say that NASA is a huge front. So I just wanted to kind of get your take on that before we dove into your event. Thank you. So I appreciate that. Okay. And so to get into the event, what everyone wants to talk about. So I want to start off. I do this with most witnesses to anything. I'd like you to bring me back. I know you spoke about it in your statement, but I want to be there. I want to be there. I want to be standing next to you. Can you describe that day in as much detail as you remember? So where were you? How were you approached? How were you summoned?
I was actually leaving the building. At the end of the hallway was the external door that went to my car. So I believed that I was walking down the hallway to go get in my car and drive back to Patrick Air Force Base. This guy stops me, and, at the time, my first inclination was, I don't want to bother with whatever the guy's doing, but he was kind of insistent and said, it'll just take a few minutes. I've got to show you this thing. So I foolishly went inside with him, and he locked the door, closed the louvers. As soon as he did that, I said, why are you doing that? He said, well, we need to do this. And my alarm bells were going off because I knew of no reason that I should be in that office, locking the door and closing the louvers. So he sits down at the computer and he said, "This will just take a few minutes." And he's doing stuff on the computer, and then all of a sudden, I can see that video is loading, and so he moved to the seat to the left, and I sat down where he was. And just about the time I sat down, lo and behold, here on the computer screen is the image of a stinking flying saucer. And yeah, it was like, what on earth are you doing? Why would you show this to me? Even if we have it, I don't have a need to know. You shouldn't be showing this to me. But at the same time, I'm looking at a flying saucer. So,
How can you
I'm
look away?
curious. So I'm sitting there thinking, man, what on earth have I gotten into? And so then he said, just wait and you'll see what it actually does. And again, I want to emphasize there was nothing on the screen that said any degree of classification, where it was located, what the time or date was. So it was just this clean screen that just happened to have a flying saucer on it. So I'm sitting there watching it, and then all of a sudden it starts doing all of the things that I described. And so, I'm very surprised to see this. And then all of a sudden there's a knock on the door, and this guy goes ballistic. And so as soon as he shuts everything off and tells me not to say anything, I realize, man, this guy had no business on earth showing that video to me. But the thing is, you can't unsee that.
No,
It's a flying saucer. I saw it. It was moving. It was doing stuff. But my goodness, in 1992, airline pilots, F-16 pilots, they're not going to report UFOs. So as I'm thinking about this, I thought, man, there is no way I want to touch this with a 10-foot pole.
Well, there's one thing.
I just decided I'm getting out of here.
Well, there's one. I want to go into the characteristics of what you're seeing on the video, because you mentioned one detail that I don't think I have ever heard. Now, I've heard a lot of UFO stories. I've heard a lot of encounter stories, and someone will always bring up the point, it didn't have an American flag on it. It didn't have a Russian flag on it. It didn't have a Chinese flag on it. So they're very unclear on what, whether it's from up there or whether it's, our own technology. What you saw did have the U.S. Air Force emblem on it, right?
Yeah. That was as shocking as seeing the vehicle itself. Now, then, it is my firm belief, when we're testing vehicles and things, we will put like rectangles and marks so that as the aircraft is moving, we can make sure that the cameras that are tracking it are seeing what's going on. So the black triangles on this completely white ship seemed totally, that seemed totally consistent to me with the test bed program. Somebody, I don't know if it had flown before or this was the first time they were testing it, but this was a prototype vehicle. Now then, one of the things about that is sometimes defense contractors will be given money and projects to do, and they will operate these things outside of the official U.S. Air Force as they're developing it. You go back, I think it was Northrop that was developing the F-20. Um, they were not authorized to spend the money to develop the F-20, but they got Chuck Yeager to promote it, and they did all of this stuff. Now, then that was done within the confines of that defense contractor. Now, then, if there was a defense contractor or several defense contractors, in the 90s, they went from NASA operating the space shuttle to the United Space Alliance. And so they said, well, we're just going to smash these contractors together and we'll let all of them do this. So the United Space Alliance was formed. If there was some sort of a contractor of this sort, it might not have even been an Air Force vehicle, but it could have been in the process of being designed and tested so that it would eventually be put into the Air Force inventory. So I cannot say that even though it said U.S. Air Force, that it was actually a U.S. Air Force inventory vehicle.
Right. And again, I do want to go into some of the characteristics because you said that it pitches, it almost turns, and it's able to essentially control its angle of attack without or maintaining its angle of attack. This sounds very similar to when you watch the gimbal video that came out with the 2017 article that was filmed in I believe it was 2017 it was filmed, 2014 when it was filmed, and it rotates, and they say it in the video, it's rotating. Now, was this craft and that video, could you draw any conclusions to how it was moving?
What the gimbal video vehicle was caught on film doing was the very same kind of thing that I saw that got me so interested with the 45 degree angle of attack. For instance, if a helicopter is flying, there's a rotor disc. Now then, the rotor disc points straight down at a 90 degree angle. If you're level, it stays where it's at. But if you change the angle of attack for the rotor disc, the force vector is going to alter. And so you're going to have a downward force vector, but you're also going to have a forward force vector. So as soon as you change the angle of attack of the rotor disc, that helicopter's moving. It's going
Every
to follow
time
the force vector that the rotor disc creates. In a fixed wing, you can have thrust vectoring so that you do different things, but the thrust vector of an aircraft is going to decide what it does, and so for traditional aircraft, if you go to a 45 degree angle, the thrust is generally coming out of the back of the vehicle from the engines. So the thrust vector is going to be straightforward. So it's going to move directly opposite the thrust vector. This thing did not appear to have a thrust vector. And as it was moving, the reason it was staying in place was because it was not demonstrating a thrust vector that would cause it to move. So something else was going on.
So this was not using any propulsion technology that you were aware of in our inventory.
That's
visible.
I'm not going to answer that question.
Okay. Fair enough.
I mentioned some electromagnetic discharges, but also one of the things was that there was sort of a mass coming up, and you had these umbilicals. I don't know what's in the umbilicals. It could have been control elements, electronics. It could also been, a massive electrical surge, so that the power plant that was on the vehicle may not have been satisfactory to perform all that it was doing. So they were feeding additional electricity so that the vehicle could do things. But
Are you?
I would be totally guessing, and because of the nature of what those guesses would be, I do not want to make those guesses.
Well, it's kind of funny, and I totally respect that. I really do. I anytime anything like that occurs, and you do, because I don't think I said that in the beginning. Feel free to decline to comment. But I'm sure a guy named T. Townsend Brown. In the 50s, all the magazines, all the scientists or propulsion experts, and at the time they weren't the aerospace. It wasn't the aerospace industry. They were aircraft companies, and all the aircraft companies were talking about how the G engines were coming, and then all of a sudden, it just goes, it just goes dark. It disappears. So a lot of people have suspected that we did crack anti-gravity, at least, by 1955, and that it probably went underground. It went to the black programs. And, a lot of people have talked about the B-2 and how that could be a reference to the Byfield-Brown, Byfield-Brown effect, and, charging each side of the stealth fighter, positive or negative, to increase its abilities. And I think that's, what you're discussing. I don't want to put words in your mouth. Of course, you did not say that, but I mean, it kind of sounds like it adds up with what the lore has told us, or at least it's fitting. Your story fits into the larger puzzle, and that's what interests me. It really does.
My response for something disappearing like that is one of two things. Either it proved to not work, or it proved to work very effectively. Now, then, if it proves not to work, everybody's going to dump it and they're going to try something else. If it actually works, then the capabilities of what works, you're going to start expanding. You're going to use them on all kinds of things. Once we got microchips, the air-to-air missiles that the United States developed were far superior to what had been available before. And every time we develop new technology, we're going to use it. Back in the 50s, we were in the Cold War. If we had something that was so extraordinary that it could change the balance of power, I don't believe we would have ignored it. We would have used that somewhere. It's like sometimes people ask me, do you believe there's a conspiracy with pharmaceutical companies to not let people know that we've actually cured cancer? Well, my response to that is, you got to be kidding me. Every doctor who does research wants to be famous. Every time a doctor Dr. Alzheimer discovered what was going on with a neighbor of his. So what do? You name it after yourself. These people, if they have a chance to name something after themselves, they have a chance to get a Nobel Prize. You think they're going to keep that quiet because somebody's afraid of money? No. If we have anything like that, whenever it is brought forward, those are the people getting the Nobel Prizes. If we had something that would absolutely cure cancer, whatever doctors were on the research, they would be jumping up and down. They would be on all the talk shows. They would be doing everything they could to get that Nobel Prize. So when people ask me questions like that, this is how I respond.
I get that. Yeah, I totally get that. So, okay, back to the event. And I want to ask one more question about the look of the craft. You had said to me in a private conversation or in a phone call that it was 60% of top and 40% bottom, shaped like a disc. You've obviously drawn that here in the best ability that you can. We don't trust me. That's better than I could do. So I appreciate it. There was a person who claimed to work at Area 51 and who told the world in 1989 that that he saw something that was shaped similarly. I don't want to say any names. I don't want to go specifics here. But
everybody knows who it is. But one thing, I can't speak to
of course
the veracity of anything he said. However, when I saw what was called the sports model, when I saw that, I thought, man, that looks, pretty similar to what I saw. And I saw it in 1992. So there would be only 3 years difference. I don't know if it would be the same type of vehicle, whether someone else was trying to do a similar sort of thing, but it was very similar to what was called the sports model.
And that's what I wanted to figure out. And I don't, because I don't want to tie anyone's story to anyone else's. Of course, I just find it odd that in 1989, in that time frame, that story comes out, and then in 92, and he had, and when he did give his testimony to George Knapp, in that silhouetted version, he had said that these were in hangars. They were in hangars, and what you saw was in a hangar, and it was undisclosed. An undisclosed hangar. There was no time or insignia that would have told you when it occurred or when it was filmed. Could it have been something similar? And I think the answer to it is, obviously something that is going to be speculation, but it is in that same time frame that you're seeing both. And I find that to be peculiar.
If I was asked the question, did you see any close similarities between this drawing and what I saw? My answer would be yes. I see some significant similarities.
Well, yeah, that's what I was asking. So I really do appreciate you going into detail about that. Now, did you see any flight surfaces, any rivets, any seams, anything that would indicate?
It was not only was there nothing of that sort, but even everything was extremely smooth. Even where the little top met the main aircraft, it was blended. If you think about the difference of the F-117 At the time they made the F-117, they didn't have very good computers, so they had to make lots of flat surfaces. By the time they made the F-22, there's no flat surfaces. Everything is very smooth and blended because anytime you have a corner or a straight edge, you're going to increase the radar signature. So if I had to say that the surface looked either like the F-117 or the F-22, I would say absolutely it looks more like the F-22 outer surface than anything that F-117 would look like.
Wow. So, to paint a picture, almost like something that was 3D printed in a hole on a mass scale.
You look at the history. The F-117 started out in the 1970s and then came out operational in the 1980s. All of the pre-production work and research for the F-22 was being done in the 1990s, and they already had computers that could figure out, okay, if we blend the wing here, if we blend the tail here, here's as long as we blend it in this way, we're going to significantly decrease the radar cross section. That is the kind of thing I saw on the vehicle I witnessed in '92.
Absolutely amazing. And
there were no straight surfaces, no corners, no rivets. There was nothing. If I was thinking, what's going to be the radar cross section of this thing, I would think, man, the radar cross section is going to be low.
So, very low chances of it being picked up, high chances of stealth capability.
Well, you would also have to do radar absorbent material and a bunch of other kinds of things, but just from the appearance of the surface, it would be susceptible to that type of engineering.
And again, so after you see the video, you turn to the person that showed you and ask something along the lines of, is this ours? Where did we get this? And he motions upward, as in it came from either the gods or.
He pointed up as though he's indicating space, and he says, "We got it from then." So that is some intelligent source. At that moment, I wasn't really interested with any additional information because he had already screwed me over.
Right. And that's that is an interesting aspect to this whole thing because, you didn't ask to see this. And, I don't even want to ask this, but I think I have to. Is there any chance that this was done to you on purpose to have you some sort of disinformation campaign? Some way to try to trick you, to discredit you. Is there any chance that could be what's at play?
This is going to sound a little bit personal, but my impression of the guy who was showing me this was that he was shorter than me, a little bit dumpier, And with just sort of the way he acted, I think he was probably someone who was not necessarily well liked by his co-workers, especially when I saw the response of those people to him when they came into a locked room and he's there, and the way he responded. I think he probably had some ego issues, and as such, if you were going to pick someone to be responsible for transmitting information, this was not the person you would choose.
Well, that actually raises multiple questions now, because, you know, so it sounds like maybe he wanted to show off a little bit.
Exactly.
Of like,
my
look
total impression was he wanted to show off to me. When he
Because-
said, I have something that even you have never seen. As soon as he
Right.
said that, I'm thinking, oh man, what's he going to do?
Right. Right. And honestly, I think people need to remember that you're a patriot the way I see it, because, you know, the first things that's going through your mind is, how do I report this? And you ultimately come to the conclusion that you can't, because, I mean, the reprisal rate was at 100%. You know, you probably fly a desk for the rest of your life, and, you know, have to go through major psych evals, and you know, every single person involved would have been, you know, in serious issues, serious trouble. Do you ever regret not reporting it?
No.
Interesting.
If I had reported it, it would have caused a whole chain of events. I have to report it to these people. They will have to report it to these people. I would not have wanted to go to my colonel, who was my rater, to say whether or not I'm doing a good job every year. And he always gave me good, excellent ratings for the job that I did. I did not want to go to him and say, hey, sir, guess what? I just saw a flying saucer.
Right.
You got to be kidding. I wasn't going to do that.
No. This is the person, you know, I just want to show a couple pictures of you, you know.
Okay, this was my flight surgeon's office out at Launch Complex 39A. I'm in the back seat here, but this is a NASA T-38 at the shuttle landing facility. So that's me when I was in West Germany, and we were getting ready for a UH-60 flight with the 3rd Infantry Division. So you can see the 3rd ID markings on it.
And then here I'm going to show, there will be superimposed, but there's a picture with you and Buzz Aldrin at a book signing. So I just want to, and I show these things because I do want to show people that you absolutely are who you say you are. Anybody, I think, will be able to look you up and see your credentials. You've provided them to me. You know, what made you decide to do this?
This picture that I have on the wall back here, it's not really a picture, but it was given to me at the time that I left the space program. And so it says Space Shuttle Support Team. It has pictures of space shuttle operations, but then the flag, below the flag, it says flag flown in space. So when they presented it to me, they said that this particular flag, they thought had flown on STS-63 with Atlantis for at least 3.7 million nautical miles.
Wow.
So this flag was flown in space and then presented to me. So they don't do things like that very often unless you've got a reason that you deserve it.
Well, and that's another thing about your character, my friend, is and that's what I want to convey to people, is that you've kept this secret for how many years now? Almost 30 30.
33 years. I
Yeah.
didn't even tell my wife for 15 years. And when I did, she said, "Well, why are you telling me this now?" And I said, "Well, I haven't told anybody else. You know, you're my wife, and you know,
Yeah. Yeah.
but she didn't appreciate the fact that I told her 15 years later.
Right. And those
Uh,
things, those kind of secrets, they'll eat away at you. And over the years, I do want to ask that because I don't think people really take this into consideration too much. When you were seeing things on the news, or when you'd be at the grocery in a supermarket checkout, and there would be a tabloid there about some crazy alien conspiracy. I mean, did it ever eat you up a little bit that, what you saw is an indication, and just a fact that you have a knowing that other people around you just simply don't?
Generally speaking, no, that really didn't affect me. Um, I I've done a lot of things down through the years. I was an ER doctor for 6 years. I had friends of mine back in the military who died for this country. One particular situation comes to mind, and we had just had a crew that had flown a perfect mission on gunnery. And so it was the first time that anyone had a perfect score for like 4 months. When they come back to the FARP, the forward arming and refueling point, the pilot who had done the shooting was actually one of our safety officers. He gets out of the aircraft. He's AH-1 Cobra. He walks to the tail of the aircraft because he has to clear the aircraft since they had used live ammunition. When he gets to the back of the aircraft, he takes a 90-degree turn and walks right into the tail rotor of the helicopter.
Oh,
Took the top of his head off. Pieces are flying everywhere. The pilot that was at the controls, the foot pedals control the tail rotor, and he could feel this sudden jerk on the foot pedals. And as he looked, everyone was running behind him. He just got a sick feeling, and I believe he threw up, and he ended up having a tremendous amount of problems. Well, there were also 18 or 19 people who had witnessed this. So I wasn't there, but bring in the flight surgeon. There's going to be things I have to do to get blood and urine samples for the accident investigation, and then I'm going to have to process his body for an autopsy. And I had to go out. I found one piece of his skull about 130 feet in front of the aircraft. So I had to recover it and make sure that the photographer got a picture of it and all this. And at the same time, I'm having to deal with all of these witnesses who are just breaking down all over. And it was just an absolutely terrible time. Well, I didn't get back to my tent. Because we were at gunnery, we were actually in tents. A GP medium was what we had. And as I came and sat down, I was just totally exhausted. But one of my medics said, "Captain Rogers, how bad was it?" And I said, "It's as bad as you could imagine." And so I'm sitting here talking to her a little bit, and she looks over at my boot and she says, "Dr. Rogers, I don't know how to tell you this, but I think part of Ronnie's brain
oh
is
my God.
boot." So I looked down, and sure enough, there's brain tissue on my boot. So I reach down and pick it up, and I throw it into this potbelly stove that we had for heat. And then to me, the very next moment, there was a hand on my shoulder, and it was my staff sergeant NCOIC, and he says, "Come on, Doc, we got to get over to the third attack." And I said, "What are you talking about? It's the middle of the night." And he said, "No, it's not. It's 0550. We need to get over there."
What?
I ended up tracking down the medic who had been talking to me, and I said, "Do you remember talking to me last night when I got back?" And she said, "Yes, sir." And I said, "Do you remember telling me that part of the brain was on my boot and I threw it in the potbelly stove?" And she said, "Yes, sir." And I said, "What did I do next?" And she said, "Well, I was trying to talk to you, but you weren't responding. So I just got back in my sleeping bag and went to sleep." I lost 5 hours from absolutely nowhere because of the trauma of all this thing. So when I look back at all the different things I've done, I've got lots of things to think about. Can't just imagine something has happened and you've got a really injured person who happens to live just a few doors from your house, and he's dying. You're doing everything you can to save him, but you can't save him, and he dies right under your hands.
Yeah. My God.
I've got lots and lots of stories. So if I'm going to be thinking of stuff, I'm going to think about that. During Hurricane Andrew, we went down and rescued people. We got credited with 23 lives saved. I hardly remember any of it because I was so busy with it, but we lost one girl. She was 16, and she had no heartbeat. Stuff had collapsed on her. Got the heartbeat going. She was breathing again, and so we're booking it to Jackson Memorial Hospital so that we can get her into surgery. But as I'm seeing her, I noticed that there was fluid coming out of her left ear. So I took a 4x4, a cotton 4x4, and I touched it to the fluid. Well, cerebrospinal fluid and water have different densities. And so if water is there, it will absorb in cotton to a certain length. But if you have cerebrospinal fluid, it will spread in the cotton, but not as far. And so if you see a double ring, you know, okay, this is water, this is cerebrospinal fluid. She's got a basilar skull fracture. I've got her breathing, I've got a heartbeat going, but this is really bad. So we dropped her off, and the next day, it was a madhouse. In the hallways, they didn't have any rooms, so they would just use Post-it notes and stick it up. And so this spot in the hallway was the room for that patient. And so all up and down all of the halls, the rooms were just sticky notes on the wall, and you had patients in every conceivable location. Well, I took another victim to the hospital the next day, and I saw one of the nurses that had taken care of this girl. And I said, did they end up doing any cranial surgery on her? And she said, oh, no, she died 2 hours later. And I said, oh my goodness. Now then, the people I saved, we were credited with 23. I hardly remember any of them, but the patients I have lost stick in my mind for the rest of my life.
Of course, right? Naturally, it's. I mean, I couldn't even. I mean, thank you for your service to this. And I think it goes a long way. It goes a long way with people to hear things like that, because you're not just someone who's coming out and saying, I saw something. I saw something and I want this or that. I want a book deal or that. No, you just want to do something for the greater good. And I think at the end of the day, we'll all be judged for our actions. And I think my friend, I think you've done
Okay.
far
Well,
more good.
there's one thing I want to say that I have probably said 10,000 times in my lifetime. When my friends died in the military, they did not put a Democratic flag on their coffin. They did not put a Republican flag on their coffin. They put an American flag on that coffin because that person gave everything they had to this country. And
Yes,
when
sir.
I see people, especially elected officials, that are more loyal to their party than they are the United States of America, that drives me crazy.
Yes,
We
sir.
have people dying, giving their lives for this country, and we have other people that manipulate money and the government and political power just for the sake of their political party. So,
It's
I'm an
truly
independent voter, and I just find the political infighting incredibly ridiculous.
it's also
They-
redundant.
We
So,
should
I mean,
we should have
think about
we
that.
should have people in Congress who are Americans first. They should do whatever it takes to be good for the United States. George Washington did not want to be president, but they said, look, this Constitution thing isn't going to work unless you're president. At the end of 4 years, he said, I'm finally going to go home. And they said, you can't. We've got so many problems. And so he had given his entire adult life to this country. But he said, okay, I'll be president for 4 more years, but I'd a lot rather go back to Mount Vernon and let everyone forget me. But he didn't do that. That's what
Right.
our founding fathers have done. The military personnel who are so superior, so dedicated to this country, will give their lives. And there were many times that I came close to dying. I would not have wanted anything but an American flag on my coffin. People, stop doing all this political garbage and try being an American for a difference.
Yes. I could not agree more with you, honestly. And I want to get into something here, because I know we discussed this in our preliminary phone conversation.
Okay.
What would you say to people that are going to be skeptical of your experience, in the sense that maybe you don't have, obviously there, in the comments and people write articles and say it's just another story, there's no evidence to support it. What would you say to people like that?
First of all, I have no evidence. But secondly, I couldn't have gained evidence. At the time, I carried a pager because we didn't have cell phones.
I remember.
I had to leave the pager at the security office at the front door. Even if I had an iPhone, I could not have taken it in there. If I had the iPhone, I could not have taken a photo in that area without permission. So, I could sit there and get some crayons and draw something, but there was zero chance I was going to get any evidence, because I was in a classified area. You can't take cell phones. I
I've
didn't
been
have
in
a
a
cell phone, but I had to leave my pager at the front. Exactly how could I have possibly gotten any evidence of this?
Yeah, and I've been in a skiff, and for anyone who doesn't realize, these clean rooms, these secure facilities, they're designed most of the time to suppress any signals and you have to give up your phone, you have to give up anything that sends or receives a signal, even if it's an Apple Watch. You cannot have it in there. No recording devices. When they bring you into these places, they ensure privacy and secrecy.
Well, operational security even goes beyond that. Let's
Right.
say that you're in a room and it is an absolutely secure room and you have two workers there. If one of the people is talking to another person in a classified location and they are talking about Project A, if the phone rings for the other person and he picks it up, he cannot hold the conversation in the vicinity to where the person A is discussing another security issue.
Mhm.
So one of them's going to have to hang up and call back later because they cannot both be discussing separate types of secure information, because the person on the other end could hear the other person speaking. So when you get into operational security, it's a lot deeper than what most people can even possibly comprehend.
Yes, I couldn't. Yeah, I couldn't have said it better myself. And that goes to show you that one of our problems scientifically, I think, and with breakthroughs, I do think is the stovepiping of information. It's the compartmentalization that has ultimately been built in to the infrastructure of our scientific advancement, through DoD contracts or other government contracts. And, Eisenhower obviously warned us about the military industrial complex for several different reasons. But I think one of them was that we would lose sight of what's important, and, that we'd become a very militaristic society or a police state. With one of the things, I think I would be crucified if I didn't ask you this. So many people in this community would crucify me if I didn't at least ask you a couple basic,
well, we don't want you harmed, so go ahead and ask it.
Well, there are these, these questions. So astronauts have obviously spoken out and said that they have seen things in space, whether it's lights, discs, whether it's orbs, this or that. I would be remiss if I didn't ask you, have you heard those same stories? And given what you've seen, do you think that it's possible?
I have heard those stories, and I've heard the stories from people that I consider absolutely reliable. The only problem is, just like me in 92, who's going to turn around and talk about this? If this is your first flight into space and you mention something like that, it's also your last flight into space.
Yes.
If you say something, the concern is, okay, they've just removed you from the astronaut corps. Most of the astronauts do not get paid a whole lot while they're astronauts, but when they retire, they get hired by all these big corporations because they say, oh, well, we want astronaut X on our board of directors. And whenever somebody comes to visit, they trot out their astronaut and do all of this stuff. You do something like that and report something, nobody's going to want you.
That is a sad reality. It is a sad reality. And, you know, I think from the landing on the moon to, you know, just International Space Station work, people have they've at least come forward in recent years because, you know, I think the stigma is fading away a little bit. You know, the Navy has put in place protocols for people to report, but there is still that stigma element to it, that people assign to it. You know, there are reporting mechanisms now, but people are still less likely to report something because of the stigma that people impose upon it. So why are you coming forward now of all time?
Because I've just retired from the Department of Defense, and I don't have to worry about any promotions or bonuses or anything of that sort because I'm out. However, I am still very concerned that for me, my family, my grandkids, there could be people out there who are going to go to extreme lengths to harass us. I really hate to think that anybody would do anything to any member of my family. But you can't put anything beyond anyone these days.
So you are aware that you're taking a chance by coming forward, and that there could be repercussions. And I think that, I think that's a sad thing because I know a lot of people are going to embrace what you're saying, and they're going to look at you for who you are, for who you've proven yourself to be. But again, there's always going to be those people who they're just kind of stuck in that box, and they don't want to pick their head up and realize that anything else is possible, or that something else may be going on that they can't explain, because God forbid they can't explain it. That frightens them the most.
Yeah. Well, there are people that we rescued from the search and rescue missions out. This one time, this boat with 5 people sunk 135 miles offshore. We had to get in our helicopters, hook up with the C-130 tanker to get out there because we could not hover with the fuel load that we took off with. So we had to go pick up these people, then aerial refuel, because if we don't do the aerial refuel, we're not going to get back to land.
Wow.
But the people we rescued appreciated what we did. However, 99.99999% of the people on this planet have never heard of what happened. And so, most people have no idea who I am. And I am just really going to be concerned that if I'm at a restaurant, somebody's going to say, "Hey, that's the flying saucer guy." And that's all I am.
Well, I think again, I am generally, I'm going to be generally optimistic about this and say, I think that people are going to receive your testimony. You did another interview with Josh Boswell, and that will have come out by the time this comes out as well. So I know you don't want to do a ton of interviews, and you want to get things off the record with as few people as possible. I think that goes a long way to say, again, you're not looking for, money. You're not asking for money. The International UFO Bureau has been your outlet that facilitated all of this.
Yes, I really want to bring that up. Mindy Topfest is the director. Terry is running everything. I just got through talking to her 5 times yesterday, but the International UFO Bureau in Oklahoma City was actually founded back in the 50s. This was one of the earliest UFO organizations. When Jimmy Carter reported his UFO,
That's right.
he wanted a place he could trust. And he wasn't president at the time, but Jimmy Carter trusted the International UFO Bureau to take his report and handle it in a proper fashion. So these are the kind of things that, as we're sort of expanding the International UFO Bureau, that we really want to make clear. We are not just taking people off the street and doing stuff. We are taking specialists in different kinds of fields. Some of them in information technology. We're doing some with, like me, military or technology backgrounds. And when you look at the people that are now part of it, and I'm looking at one of them on the other side of the screen here.
Yes.
These are extremely professional people. This is not being handled in a lackadaisical manner. It is not being treated as, just some story. The stuff we're doing will make a difference. So anyone who is not paid attention to the International UFO Bureau, they certainly need to do that. And there's no better time than now. But
yeah,
the Bureau is going to make a difference.
And what would you say to any other whistleblower of any sort? If they had an experience, or if they have any information that they wanted to share with the public, given your experience, would the International UFO Bureau be capable of handling that?
Yes, they would. However, everything about this 92 experience is just now being revealed. So I can't tell you what the 6-month repercussions are going to be, because it's going to take 6 months for me to find that out. So
right.
I would encourage people to tell the stories that they have. When I was a flight surgeon, we had multiple aircraft mishaps. And so we would always look for every witness who saw anything about that aircraft mishap. And we want to get their report, because one person might tell one little detail that becomes very important. And then someone else has a different detail, and, maybe they're not very accurate about this, but they tell us this one thing. And as soon as we hear that, we say, oh my goodness, people these days, because of what happened in New York, they're asking about mass bumping. Well, mass bumping originated back in Vietnam when the Hueys were first being used. So they were crashing, and they didn't know why. So they ended up having to put special cushions on the dual rotor to prevent mass bumping. But
right.
If you don't pay attention, you still lose a helicopter and crew.
Right. And we talked earlier about your book, Impact, and you tell that story. It's almost like the muse was working through you, and you were channeling something, because the story you told, almost, it almost happens. It does happen a few years later, and other people have described that.
I have heard the story that, I've not done research on it, but sometime or another, I heard that in like 1897, somebody wrote a novel about a ship on its maiden voyage going from England to the United States, it hits an iceberg and sinks. And supposedly the name of the ship was the Titan.
Mm.
And then
Oh,
and then in 1912, the Titanic does exactly what the guy wrote in the book. Well, I hate to say this, but what I predicted would happen if you had damage to the thermal protection system and tried to land anyway, tried to go through entry without protecting the thermal protection system, you're going to die. And 8 years later, the crew of Columbia was lost because they did not have a repair kit so that they could return to Earth in a safe manner. And
that's a tragedy.
Oh my goodness, it's such a tragedy, but it when that happened, it just broke my heart. I mean, man, I told you that.
Right. It's almost worse.
Should have listened.
It's almost worse in your case because you did. It's almost like I said, cursed with information, and the could haves, the would haves, and the did nots. Those will eat away at you, and I'm sure you have to come to grips with it some way, and you have to some degree, but there's still that inkling of like, I feel like we could have done more. We could have done more. And I really want to thank you for having the courage to, come forward and tell what you saw. I think it is a piece in a larger puzzle that we continue to try to understand. It's something that, we're not dealing with something that's simple here. These phenomena are among the most complex. These questions are complex, and
they're very old. I mean, if
very
you
old.
Go back in the Bible, Elijah and Elisha are walking through Jericho, and the sons of the prophets come out to Elisha and say, "Hey, don't you know that your boss is going to be taken up to heaven today?" Well, he says, yeah, I know, don't bring it up. So they cross the Jordan River, and on the other side, it's like, I hate to say it like this, but I'm going to anyway. He went through the check-in process. He put his luggage out there. He went to gate number 1. This fiery chariot spacecraft comes down and lands. He gets on, his luggage gets on, and then they take off. Now, then, at the time, they had no word for rocket. The fastest thing they knew was a chariot. But this fiery chariot with smoke takes off and leaves. Well, if you took some of those very people out to a space shuttle launch when I was doing that, and they watched these 7 people in these funny orange suits climb onto the space shuttle, and they don't know what a space shuttle is, and then all of a sudden they watch, and this tremendous roar comes out, and flames and smoke are coming up, and you see these people go up into space. They would have no words to describe what they had seen. And so when we look at this fiery chariot that took Elijah to heaven, into space, how do we know what that fiery chariot was? It could have been a piece of technology that we now understand that those people wouldn't have known. If I took an iPhone back to ancient Egypt and I took pictures of people and I did all this stuff you can do, somebody's 5 miles away and I talked to them on the iPhone, they would think I was a god. They'd be worshiping me or think that I'm a devil and put me to death.
Right.
But it's technology.
Right. And given I guess what I want to get your take on that because it is kind of interesting. It's always interested me. You talked about earlier, the how they named the ships in Atlantis, and do you believe that could possibly have been a more advanced civilization that existed pre-ice age, pre the last ice age, and that that's who may be being referenced in a lot of these stories of antiquity and back even further of this civilization that seems to be global and to have godlike powers. Could that have been misidentified technology?
Well, the one thing I would say is when you look at the archaeology, where are the remnants of any of this thing? If we have a 747 crash, they'll go out in the field and they'll try to pick up everything that's there. But you could go back 5 years later and find a little piece of wire that was there, and it's copper and it's got a coating on it because it was part of an aircraft. If you had that kind of technology, there should be that sort of residue that's out there. But I want you to think about something else. Our solar system is 4.6 billion years old. If there's, the star Antares that has solar system with, say, 2 planets that actually developed intelligent life. But they did that 100,000 years before us. Look at the technology difference between now and 1,000 years ago. If you're talking about 100,000 years in the future, in those other planets in other solar systems, they could be so far ahead of us that they're watching us just to make sure we don't kill ourselves. But they're not necessarily going to intervene a lot. Who's a Star Trek fan? The prime directive. You don't alter the development of culture on rather primitive planets.
Yeah, you don't play God.
Yeah, according to someone who was from a planet 100,000 years ahead of us, we would look primitive.
Absolutely.
And then all of a sudden, a nuclear weapon goes off. Well, this alerts everybody. Well, when did the biggest part of the UFO phenomena start? Once we set off nuclear weapons. And so that's, there could be early warning systems that, maybe they can monitor gravitational waves that we can't. Maybe they've actually discovered a graviton with a +2 rotation boson. There is no telling what they might know that we don't know. And so us trying to figure that out, I heard of some islands in the South Pacific that during World War II, all of a sudden the Navy lands and we have airplanes and we
the
do
cargo
all this
cults
stuff. And then all of a sudden, 2 years later, everybody leaves. And, some of these primitive islanders started building what looked to be airplanes as best they could make it. And they thought the gods had visited them. It wasn't the gods, it was the Navy and the Air Force. But it was beyond their capability to comprehend.
Yeah, that's the classic cargo cult story. I love that one because it gives you like a modern day case study into what happens when what we would call superior civilization meets more primitive civilization. And
but we have actual evidence. The people went back there and they found this is the evidence of the thought process of these humans. They thought they met gods.
Yeah.
No, they were Americans, but not gods.
Yes. And that's a great, that's a great point. That's a great story. Dr. Gregory Rogers, I thank you so much. This is only going to be, I think, part 1. I think we're going to try to do a part 2. And we're going to try to do that. I would like to do it in person. So before I let you go, what do you hope that people understand most from you coming forward? What do you hope to get from this? What, like, from people?
I hope we I hope we begin to consider the fact that there are tiny little problems that we make into major molehills, and then all of a sudden something happens. There were people in villages that were fighting each other in Poland. And then on September 1st, 1939, the Germans invade. Well, the arguments they were having with their neighbors are nothing compared to the fact that panzers are rolling through their village. We don't always have a good perspective on what the most important things in our lives should be.
That is wonderful. That's truly wonderful. Where can people find out more about your story, or more about you? Can they buy the book Impact on Amazon?
Oh yeah, Amazon. You can contact the company that makes it, Austin McCauley, but it should be on Barnes and Noble or whatever.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Yeah.
But
I think it's a wonderful story.
Well, I wanted it to be very educational. When people get through with my story, they're going to say, "Man, I had no idea the space program was this complex."
Yes, and I think it's super important to highlight that it's not, it's the space program, but ultimately there's politics involved. There's so many components. There's so many working pieces and moving pieces that, one decision doesn't get made without 7 to 8 people, agreeing or disagreeing. So, for everything that you've done, for everything that you've done for your country, I want to say thank you for your testimony as well. And if given an opportunity, would you speak under oath?
Sure.
Okay. Well, with that being said, everybody, watch out for part 2. The International UFO Bureau will definitely be announcing that, as well as, if you want to stay up to date with the story, International UFO Bureau, all the links are in the description below. This has mainly been brought to you by the International UFO Bureau in partnership with Total Disclosure and, like I said, and Mindy Tautfest, the leader of the Bureau. So with that being said, we will catch you next time. Keep your eye on the sky. You never know what might fly by. Thank you, Dr. Rogers, for everything.
It was my pleasure.